Hello and welcome to today's Euractiv event that is brought to you together with the Z Zurich Foundation. We're going to be talking today about mental health amongst young people, something that has been at the top of agenda for a long time, but which involves very complex and interlinked risk factors. We're going to try and pick those apart today and ask how can the EU promote mental well-being amongst young people and safeguard their mental health. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to actually ask you, our audience, to get involved as well. As always, with these Euractiv debates, we encourage you to ask questions. So for those in the room, you can use your smartphones to scan the QR code that you can see on the screen or around the room. For everyone joining online, of course, you can use the box on your screen, or you can go with your browser to slido.com and put in the code mental health. And we do encourage you to get your questions to us early and to indicate to whom they are addressed, because we have an excellent panel of speakers and we want to get as much information to you as possible in the next 90 minutes. So do get your questions coming through. Well, let's meet our speakers today. So joining us, we are delighted to have Kasia Zurjak, who is Head of Unit in Combating Diseases in DG RTD at the European Commission. Maria Walsh, MEP, is co-chair MEP of the Alliance for Mental Health in the European Parliament, first elected in 2019 and of course still here with us. Maria represents the constituency of Midlands North West in Ireland. We also have joining us the Director of Mental Health Europe, Claudia Marinetti. Lana Power, also Vice President of the European Students' Union, bringing us the youth angle. Sarah Klein is CEO and co-founder of United for Global Mental Health, which is the Secretariat of the Global Mental Health Action Network and has over 6,000 members in more than 170 countries. And of course, joining us, Chair of the Z Zurich Foundation, we have Gary Shaughnessy, our token man on the panel for today. Well, thank you all very much for joining. Let's start with a little bit of scene setting. So Kasia, if you could give me your sort of first thoughts on the topic of youth mental health in Europe today in 2025.
Okay. Good morning. I hope you can hear me. I just had a little microphone accident before the panel started, but okay, we are in business. Okay, the state of mental health in Europe at present, especially among the younger generation, has a lot of space for improvement, if I can put it in very commission terms, right? And I'm sure the parliament speakers and other speakers would put it in much more straightforward terms. But I also want to say that the progress we have made in the last 20 years working on mental health has been great. So I will come back to this because mental health was my first love, was the first job actually consulting for Mental Health Europe 25 years ago. And I think a lot has happened in that period. I'll bring to our discussion today a research and innovation perspective, showing how much an evidence from research on brain, on the connection between climate and brain, connection between dopamine-releasing activities like social media, how much the microbiome brain link is important, how all of this is rooted in EU, where we have levers from the EU policy side, and how we can make that change together. But the starting point is that we have to act now because the figures speak for themselves.
Yes, we will hear indeed a bit more about that indeed. And I think you've highlighted, as I said at the outset, how interconnected these issues are and how complex. Maria, your thoughts? I know this is something you take a particular interest in.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you very much for having me here. I mean, and ultimately, to pick up what Kasia said and put a little bit more what is happening on the ground in the constituency that I represent, Midlands North West, it is in a dire straits. So right now, second leading cause of death is death by suicide for 10 to 19-year-olds. We have 1 in 2 had experienced some form of mental health prior to the pandemic. And if you look at research coming from UK-based universities that did a lot of work around mental health supports from the financial crash, it was approximately 5 years before they really started seeing their citizens come to the fore. And we're in that sweet spot to really speak truthfully. But I have to say, I mean, this is where it comes down to as a policymaker for me. It's not seen or deemed a competency of the European Union. Therefore, it falls into that grey area of, as a policymaker, what can I do? What can we make sure the Commission does and works on, and then what do we need to make sure council sees as a priority. And that grey area is slowly becoming more colourful, dare I say, because we have more and more like-minded MEPs, and I have to give credit, the President Commission and the former Commissioner for Health, Stella Kyriakides, built a brilliant platform last mandate, and we need to draw on that mantle. I mean, never before had we had a Commission President talk about mental health in our State of the Union on multiple occasions. That's a promise. However, when we look at preventative tools, reactive measures, funding supports for the likes of Mental Health Europe, Gamian, any other organisation, CSO supports in particular, that is on the decline because sadly our Parliament has shifted somewhat to a more right-based approach. So we need to find those centre voices, make mental health that political priority, which it needs to, because ultimately, back to what I shared at the start, the numbers are only, and like lived experience of mental health, realities of mental health is becoming to the fore. And we can spin it in any other way, putting an economic stance on it in terms of absenteeism, in terms of leaving the workplace in full-time capacity, leaving education platforms, only speaking to or utilising social media for conversations and support. I mean, ultimately, the triangle of work, family and community has disintegrated over the last number of generations. And when you look at mental health within that realm, it's becoming less and less a priority. So I hope everybody can hear it in my voice, be it in the room or online, that we have a group of 80, if not more, mental health interested MEPs, and we had that formatted group last Thursday in Strasbourg. And our issue is then to make sure it becomes a political priority. So when I'm sitting in this room in 5 years' time, I can say these are the 10, if not 20 things that we have dealt with and fixed and supported our citizens on the ground, particularly our young people, going forward.
Thank you.
Thanks. Tried to shove it all in there.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground, but we're going to dig into some of it in more detail, including, as you say, I mean, making this economic argument. It is still worth making that, and maybe talking a little about de-risking when we think of health insurance and so on, because ultimately, if it all ends up in the same place with the same goal of better mental health, it's worth doing. Claudia, Mental Health Europe, tell us what your focus is at the moment and why it's important that we're having this discussion today.
Thank you very much. So we are an organization that works basically very much on a psychosocial approach to mental health. It's a mental health in all policies approach. It's a human rights-based approach. And it's a recovery approach when it comes to people that have mental health problems. So the rights aspect is very important for us. The social inclusion aspect is very important to us. And also the destigmatizing and tackling discrimination is very important to us. We have worked on the topic of youth mental health for quite some years now. We've also part of one of the work strands of the WHO pan-European initiative working on this. I think that, and of course we work very closely with the Parliament, I think that there have been changes in the last few years, positive and negative changes. So yes, there is a stress on mental health and especially on youth mental health. At the same time, I think that young people are better in touch with their own mental health and with the whole topic. They are ready, they are leaders or leaders in the making, so we have a strong youth, and so we really need to capitalize and to make sure that there is the space for youth to take this leadership role. And when it comes at political level, I think that we have seen changes. I mean, amazing, like the first president that mentions mental health during the State of the Union. We've had, even at the level of the council, I find, like in the past, since Spain at least, we had various council conclusions on mental health, so the interest is there, the talk is there. Now the question is, are we talking the right way about mental health? I am not sure that the narrative is there yet. So for instance, I'm very pleased that there is more interest in terms of research, but there is a lot of focus on brain health. Brain health is important, but brain health is not mental health. And so we need really to move forward also when it comes to the social, socioeconomic, technological, and environmental determinants of mental health, especially for young people. And then the other question is around implementation. Is implementation there? Is it done the right way? Are member states receiving the type of support and guidance to do this? And I'll stop here.
Thank you. Because we're going to hear from Lana. you're, if you like, representing the European Students' Union. I mean, how much of an issue is mental health to you?
So I would say, first of all, thank you for the invitation and talking about youth mental health. I think it's important to know that it's not just a personal struggle, it's a systemic issue and it is escalating. Even before the pandemic, the students across Europe were facing increasing levels of anxiety, stress and burnout. So COVID-19 pandemic didn't create the crisis, but it exposed it and it amplified it. So that's why we believe that mental well-being must be seen as fundamental right, not a luxury, which means going beyond short-term fixes. We really need systemic transformation, one that embeds prevention and well-being into the core of educational systems, of social policies, and also public health strategies. And here we see that EU has a unique opportunity and also responsibility to lead this shift through stronger funding mechanisms, cross-country collaboration and policy alignment. The EU can support member states in building inclusive, proactive mental health ecosystems. And we have seen promising initiatives across Europe, from low threshold university counseling services to student-led peer support programs. But those are often underfunded, fragmented, and not accessible to all. So we must scale what works and also share best practices across borders. And talking from student perspective myself, I'm happy that we can notice that amongst younger generations, they're talking more about mental health. They're being more aware of mental health and struggles that they're facing. But it's also important to use this momentum to show them support and to help them in the really important journey that they're leading, which is also connected to removing the stigma around mental health. Because a lot of students still and young people are not open maybe to discuss this with their families, with their even physicians, etc., or teachers, educators. So I think that we can see young people doing really important steps, but we need to make sure that we also use this momentum to motivate them, to give them means to do it, and also to help them transfer this movement to all other generations.
That's something that's very interesting, and we'll probably pick up on it because I think, as Claudia pointed out, some of the youth today have better tools, better language about how to discuss this maybe than previous generations, but then there's different risk factors associated with each generation, and there might be something to take from the youth and pass on to maybe the elderly population who have their own mental health crisis. Sarah, I suppose you can give us the more global context, but tell us, at least initially, for your opening thoughts on what you consider to be the situation with youth mental health in the EU today.
Yes, I mean, I think, to be honest, I will go straight to the global because I think you have a lot of Europe experts here. So our organisation is the Secretariat for the Global Mental Health Action Network. As you said, it has 6,000 members in 170 countries, of which that includes countries in Europe. To give one example, we're working with an initiative called the Being Initiative that's been doing a survey of youth mental health in different countries. That included Romania. So if we take that, for example, the example of Romania, some of the issues that were raised were around bullying and cyberbullying, around exposure to violence, but also the issue of family and stigma. So some of the things that young people struggle with is actually how to talk within their own families about mental health and the support that they may or may not receive from their parents. So we see a variety of different issues, and I think those are other factors in youth mental health around the world. There are differences. So during COVID in Europe, there was a lot of discussion about people being confined to their homes, what it meant to be in close proximity to your family. But in other countries where you didn't have a lockdown, young people struggled a lot with their economically. Could they find a job? Could they find employment? Was a big concern during COVID. So different countries and different people have experienced mental health differently. Also, young people are students, but they are also parents. And actually it is young parents, teenage parents, young parents who are at the greatest risk of mental ill health, which is really tragic both for them, but also for, in the case of young women, their unborn child. So women who have poor mental health during pregnancy are more likely to give birth to an underweight child, a child that could struggle with their development. So it's so important to think of young people not just as students, although that is extremely important, but also as people who are already in the economy, who are already working, or are parents. In terms of youth mental health at a global level, there are some encouraging signs. So one of the things is the number and spread of countries around the world that are prioritizing youth mental health. For example, South Africa has the G20 presidency this year and has made youth mental health one of its priorities. China has made mental health one of its priority areas, and we'll be discussing that further at the World Health Assembly. The presidency here, Poland, has made mental health one of their priorities, young people's mental health. So what we're seeing is leadership from a variety of different places, including Europe. That's very encouraging. And we're looking towards the UN high-level meeting this year on NCDs and mental health as a key moment for the international community as a whole to make a series of promises and commitments towards better mental health in the future, and for each government, and with the support of the European institutions, to actually take next steps towards positive mental health and improvements in service delivery.
Well, thank you. Gary, one of the co-sponsors of today's event, why are we all here today at this juncture? Why is it important now?
Just listening to Sarah's comments, actually, we're very used to talking about COVID as an epidemic, but we've got a silent epidemic here. There are, communities, every community across this world is being affected by mental health issues. Every community is getting the same issues that Maria talked about in terms of suicide rates, self-harm rates, people's livelihoods and futures destroyed because of our failure to adopt a structure and strategy that can resolve it. We are making progress, I totally agree, but it's metre by metre, and it needs to be kilometre by kilometre. And we know that prevention works financially, we know it works societally, and yet very little is spent on prevention and bringing that to the fore as far as our youth of today are concerned. And finally, we know that we're failing our youth of today from another angle. Half of those surveyed say that the current system doesn't meet their needs. That's double the level of people who gave that response who are in the adult population. And that has to change.
Well, let's start. I mean, you've alluded to, many of you in your opening remarks, some of the challenges we face. I mean, let's start with some of the problems before we look at what might be the solutions. And I'm going to jump around a little bit. I mean, Claudia, I'm going to start with you. We'll start with the COVID pandemic because, it's a sort of an underpinning seismic shift of events in our recent history. And it did impact the mental health of young people aged, let's say, 15 to 24. Tell me a bit more about that, whether there are any studies in that, and then I'll ask the rest of the panel for their thoughts as well.
I think that there are quite a few data out there that mention also COVID. There has been actually, I think, just a couple of days ago, ACD also published a new report which was also around good practices. We do know that that COVID basically had an impact on mental health, even of children. So there was even younger, because it was kids that are starting their socialization journey as well, that were completely isolated. But also, what did COVID do? It isolated people. It increased, unfortunately, the impact of domestic violence, because people were stuck at home with no respite that they could find somewhere else, kids at school, for instance, but of course impact on women, and that has then a direct impact on their children. The whole uncertainty that families faced vis-a-vis the economy. So all of this has an impact on young people. And I would say, that is there, but that also, of course, opened the door. And I think that what happened with COVID is that there has been a shift in society, an initial shift really into understanding mental health, which if before it was more like, oh, there is something wrong with you, there is the famous theory about the chemical imbalance in the brain, which is not real, and this is quite clear. But it was really, really individualized. I think that COVID showed that a situation can impact the mental health of anyone, and so how important are the socioeconomic factors around it. So this is basically the impact that COVID had, but also the uncertainty. It brought a lot of uncertainty, and since then, it has been uncertainty after uncertainty. All of the crises is uncertainty. Climate change, uncertainty. Cost of living crisis, uncertainty. War, and that builds and puts pressure.
Asher, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to follow through on the specific figures, and indeed, a Health at a Glance report looked at the increase in self-reported mental health issues in the youth population and looked at 2 time points, 2018, so pre-COVID clearly, and 2022. So there was an increase for the 11-year-olds from 30 to 36, 6% increase, but a really marked increase was in the young adolescents. So for 15 years old, there was a 10% increase from 42 to 52% reporting issues like anxiety, nervousness, depressive symptoms. And I think what you said really about COVID changing the way we live and how the home community networks were affected, I think what I want to also emphasize here, where we are discussing mental health of youth, we should really also make that link to the childhood experiences, right? Because it's the children, their early school and development, the family setting, you were mentioning even from very early prenatal stage, how this has a compounding effect over the life course and results in then, ability or lack of ability to be resilient, to cope. And I'd like to bring a recommended reading for all of us. We are big fans of this, Anxious Generation, which really, one phrase that the author puts forward is like, bring children back to earth, have their childhoods getting dirty, being out in the streets, playing, having this intergenerational relations with the grandparents, and allow them to fail. And you don't do that if you're exposed to screen for too often, which was very often a necessity during COVID, right? Parents were working, the kids were there, they had to study. Sometimes the school program did not deliver, or when you had a toddler, you had to do 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. So just to say, let's look from early on. And really, this increase in anxiety is well documented because of COVID, and now compounding crises, the poly-crisis. You mentioned the war, you mentioned the climate change. I mean, economic security and the kind of the global unraveling that we are experiencing now.
Maria, same question to you. What have been the sort of exacerbating factors? We'll leave the digital aside for the moment because I think we're going to have a full round discussing digital technologies, but other areas where COVID made mental health worse.
And just hearing from the shares up to this point, and probably really thinking about it on my commutes between Ireland and here and elsewhere, there's such a pendulum shift to extreme burnout, which I think if we probably looked in all of our lives right now, where are you sitting within that? And the terminology and the recommendations to get yourself out of that, as well as addicted to stress cortisol. And that pendulum swing becomes really difficult hour by hour, day by day. And I'm often left wondering on a personal policy and then within the institutions, just are we pushing that needle further to progress or away? And it's really dependent on amendments we're putting down. Are they consistent to what all individuals are sharing here, and no doubt many from the floor, age-specific, generation-specific livelihoods? And again, cut me off here because I go into a bit of a brain dump mentality when we talk about mental health, but I'm so conscious from an Irish perspective. We have such a negative connotation towards mental health, and we've had for so long, that if not too long ago, we joined in 1973 here, the EEC at the time, and even prior to that, the impact our our society had on women or on those with mental health or disability, while it has drastically shifted and changed, we haven't put the foundation in place, so people don't know where to go. I'm always so conscious. I get asked all the time by parents, like, my kid is showing this sign, or we've spoken to a GP and we're on this medication, but I don't know how to show up as a good adult in order to allow for the resilience or the space to have meaningful conversation about mental health, because I wasn't taught. So the ripple effect is real. And I wish it was as easy as one blanket check or one sweeping brush of change, so that people see value in themselves, they see value in the voice that they're adding to any conversation, and that we as policymakers at every level, and those doing work on a daily basis within this field, get the support they need. So I'm always so conscious of, do we have the right education and training for ourselves as policymakers to impact better policy on those with mental health? We have 20 odd committees. Mental health has to factor, in my belief, in every one of those committees, not just one or the other. It is not just down to Sant committee or the gender equality committee. It also has to feature in the IMCO, as well as Agri, as well as Reg. It has to cover everything. Do we talk enough about it at an EU level, and again, just through my own prism of change, on the careers in mental health? Because we can write as much policy as we want or have these conversations, but if we don't have people with an appetite to get into the career in any facet, then we can continue to talk about this again and again and again. We just don't have that skill set there. So I don't know if I answered your question. I get into a little bit of a ravel of it, but it's a collective approach. There's so many facets, and it's ultimately, at the end of the game, mental health has to become a priority. I'm so conscious. We have people in this room and online who no doubt are aware of their mental health, are working towards mental health positivity in whatever shape or form. It's the people outside of these rooms that we have to sadly convince still to make it a priority.
Well, you've raised some interesting issues there as well. I mean, it varies from country to country. There are some countries where overemphasis is put on sort this out in your family, and the family is abandoned as a unit. It's not seen as a public health problem, versus the over-medicalization where the family is cut out and say, just do as the professionals tell you and don't get involved in your own care. So the pendulum can swing too much in either way. I'm going to talk about how they can strike a balance with giving a plurality of health options on the table for people who need them. Sarah, I noticed you nodding along with a lot of what Maria is saying, and I'm trying to pick apart that there are different cultural approaches in different parts of the world. So tell us a bit about your impression of what impact COVID had, since we're staying with that for the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it had a range of effects. So we worked with the UN Secretary General on the production of a briefing on mental health and COVID at the beginning of the crisis. And one of the things that we did as an organisation is set up weekly webinars with the Lancet Psychiatry and WHO and others to get information out in real time, because things were changing so fast. And one of the earliest concerns, which you briefly mentioned, Maria, was actually the workforce. So the health workforce was hugely impacted by COVID in terms of their mental health as well as their physical health and safety. And I think sometimes we forget the devastation that was wrought on the health sector as they sought to try and cope. So that was a factor, and has been a long-term impact, because you saw people leaving the profession or sadly who lost their lives to COVID. What we also saw during COVID was actually a defunding of mental health and a reduction in services and capacity. So wards were given over to respiratory disease for very obvious reasons, but actually there were just big cuts in funding and capacity on mental health. So at the very time you needed it, it was cut. It was one of the first things cut. I think looking forward, COVID did, as we've already discussed, give a much more awareness to a much broader section of society, but also across the world, far more attention to mental health. So coming out of COVID, when you go to the World Health Assembly, which is where all the health ministers gather every year, the number of ministers talking about mental health was I mean, just skyrocketed. It was incredible. And asking for help, asking for support, asking for guidance from WHO and others. And we've seen that consistently since. It hasn't dropped off. So at the more recent WHO Executive Board meeting, which is the precursor to the World Health Assembly, again, you had multiple countries saying mental health is important, we want to do something, these are the things that we're going to do. And that's across Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, the Americas, it's everywhere. And I think that's a real positive. Sad that it took a COVID to do that, but it has changed the landscape. In terms of looking forward and this point about polycrisis, it's very natural that people will experience anxiety during crisis. That's a natural thing to do. And I think there's this careful balance we have to seek between all of us live on a spectrum of good or poor mental health over the course of our lifetime. That's quite normal in the way that your physical health may be better or worse. So I think we have to avoid pathologizing all mental health and saying this is a disease, this is a thing that needs treatment, needs a label. But there are people with more severe mental health conditions, of which I am one. I live with bipolar and anxiety, for whom this is a lifelong experience. And for us, it is hard because we don't see the same attention paid to those with a lifelong condition. And very often, young people with a lifelong condition are the ones that are not being addressed, which was my experience, or there aren't youth-friendly facilities and services for young people. It was only, I think we forget that it's relatively recent that services started being oriented towards young people. It was always an adult problem. It was never a child problem. It was never a youth problem, certainly not for me growing up either. And so that's still a process. And I think one of the reasons you talked about the fact that young people are not satisfied with the service or that they're provided is because there isn't really one. There's not one that's geared for young people. And I think that's something coming out of COVID where the demand for that has massively accelerated but not necessarily kept pace with supply.
Lana, I want you to talk to me a little bit about the disruption during COVID of study and career plans and maybe the impact then of study going online. And I want to use this as an opportunity to segue into discussing the digital problems before I ask Gary about the initiatives we've got to sort of solve some of these. So tell us a bit about that in your experience. What have you discovered?
Yeah, so I can also say personally, COVID started on my first year of studying. So it was a couple of months getting used to the new city, getting used to what's going on, and then COVID hit. And then nobody knows what to do. The level of insecurity which occurs for every young people that changes, that faces the big change in their life was even more enhanced with this insecurity related not just for us, but also our families. Because one thing that is oftentimes forgotten to be mentioned is the fear that young people had during the COVID also and responsibility about their families. Will I go somewhere and then come home and meet with my grandparents or somebody else, and can I infect them? Can I cause them pain? Can I cause their health problems? So I think that every young person, no matter if they were in school, in higher education or starting to work, their life was majorly disrupted. One thing that was also where focus was put the most, I would say, is care for elderly and policies for elderly, which of course makes sense due to aging population, due to due to risk factors. But at the same time, the message that's oftentimes still sent to young people is, you will be fine. You're young, you will find a way. And then you're faced with so many issues and difficulties that you just don't know how to find that way. With all of the crises that were already mentioned, there is also eco-anxiety, which is very prevalent amongst younger generations. So it's not just personal issues, but it's also the expectations and the hopes that young people have for their future, the level of insecurity about also finding the job, economic crisis, housing crisis, sustainability issues, ecological issues that we are facing, which heavily affects the future that we can expect. And since COVID, I think that was one of the points where the talk about the mental health also started more. So we can take that as one of the positive outcomes. But I wouldn't say that enough has been done. And from that perspective, I think that we also need to broaden the view. And broaden the areas that we're focusing on when it comes to tackling these issues. Then you also mentioned online learning, online environment. Of course, that was something we had to adapt to, and that sort of trapped young people in a way because of all of the anxiety and problems that they were facing, moving all social interactions in digital spectrum, in digital sphere. Also, of course, had effect on their behavior, their habits, the way that they interact together. Because we all know that internet can be a very cruel place, especially looking at social media. So I would say that they were sort of forced in the period of life when they develop the most friendships, the most interactions and connections with other people, to seek this in an online environment, which of course is not regulated enough, where a lot is happening, which can have quite an impact to them. So I think that's also one of the things that they're trying to overcome right now. All of the stigma, all of the also online bullying, etc., that was happening. Those are the topics you don't necessarily talk with your parents about. If you have some problems in school and teacher sees it, they can react to it. But if we talk about online environment, where people are also more open, where they don't necessarily care about social norms that they would care in one-on-one contact, it's also very problematic because they don't know who to turn to, they don't know who to talk to, and if there is nobody else who would notice that, as we can see when it comes to real-life examples, it's also very hard to react to it, but also sometimes it's very hard for them to express why certain things have affected them in a certain way, when it's not something that's necessarily tangible, when it's happening virtually.
Exactly, and some of these problems, like maybe bullying, have been around for time immemorial, but it's a different matter if the bully is in your pocket at all times. There's no real safe space to go to. So, well, come on, Kasia, I'm going to ask you a little bit about what we can do at EU level, maybe with protecting young people online. But Gary, tell us a bit about the programs that I know you're working on, or that the foundation is working on.
Very happy to, and I think this hopefully will pick up on some of the points that have been made about the differentiation of different cultures and circumstances in which they land. We run initiatives in about approaching 50 countries across the world around mental well-being. We have multi-year agreements for 27 of those countries. And what we've seen is consistently, whether they're focused on schools, whether they're focused on sport, whether they're focused on a combination of those two, and communities and families, then literally €1 spent gives you around 24 euros of financial benefit. The thing that varies, though, is the context in which that economic case happens, because in some cases the communities are very supportive and inclusive. In some cases this is on the edge of what is a cultural standard, if that makes sense. So for me, the key thing is how can we move to a much more holistic way of introducing programs that are therefore much more sustainable. And just one further thing I'd like to just make the point about, why is this urgent other than the fact that it clearly is personally urgent for all of those people involved? What we've seen is empathy move positively towards mental health and mental well-being over the last few years. But we're also now seeing taxpayers starting to recognise that the cost of that is significant, and therefore my worry is that the empathy will start to reverse unless we find an effective, efficient and clearly valuable way of making those initiatives work in both the short term and the long term.
Well, Kasia, I mean, how can the EU, I mean, we know that health is a national competency, but that doesn't mean nothing can be done at EU level. And I am thinking in particular of things like some of the safeguards we see in the digital world in particular. Tell us a bit about what is happening at EU level there.
Well, I think, Maria, you phrased it very well, that at the EU level, and that's what you mentioned, health is a national competence, and many of the levers for well-being are really maybe at the community level, family level, school level. My particular perspective here is about research and innovation, and let me link it to an initiative that was announced in the mission letter of Commissioner Varhelyi, right, where it says there will be an inquiry looking at the mental health impact of social media exposure, right? And I think this is very important that here we come with very strong data that it will be a polarizing discussion, right? There are already national solutions, like in Denmark, saying there is a social media ban or like a phone-free school until the age of 14. In other legislatures, phones are forbidden maybe until 16 at school. So we are talking about possibility for legislation. No? And we have to be sure that at EU level, it would be the right level to do that. And I think there is a power of strong evidence coming from the research, and over the last 10 years we have invested 7 billion euro, but in both biomedical research, but also in research around health prevention, promotion, societal and kind of humanities input to health. We have colleagues working on the impact of arts and culture as a therapy, right? Having a cultural prescription, which is something that was practiced in Brussels here in the post-COVID years, and I think specifically on this question of digital, to avoid this polarization, all digital good, all digital bad, it is important to have data, because digital can be source of innovation for better mental health and well-being, like Headspace, a great app. I really enjoy it, but it can also be a trigger. So my colleagues who are neuroscientists explained to me that there is a period of rapid brain development in the young adolescents, and this part of brain called prefrontal cortex is responsible for impulse control. And if you're exposed to an app that gives you this kind of feedback, immediate feedback, you talked about a bully in your pocket. It's not a bully, it's hundreds of bullies, dozens of bullies in your pocket. Somebody liked your post, somebody disliked your post, answered in an emoji that comments and perhaps attacks you, shared it. So you were training just one part of the brain to respond and to be high on dopamine. If we can show in really scientific evidence what works with social media exposure and what does not work, that is a contribution that we would like to make from the research and innovation perspective, right? And then have the youth voices heard through youth panels, through people working at the community level. How is there a legislative initiative needed or not, or should it be done in a different setting at school, at a national level? Yeah, yes.
It's interesting because, of course, addiction is a mental health issue,
Exactly.
but we don't necessarily focus on digital addiction, particularly among young people, as a big problem. Maybe we should. Maria, what can be done at EU level? I mean, obviously you've got your intergroup in the Parliament, but, you know, practical examples.
Yeah, I mean, practical examples. So picking up from the digital space, as we debate and discuss going forward the multi-financial framework, there has to be set aside money for research and development and innovation within the capsule of mental health, supports for CSOs and NGOs that work specifically on mental health. And I know that's a challenge. Claudia and I were talking before this started. We have to work to what the WHO recommends, that 10% of our national mental health budget is assigned to mental health in any shape or form, higher if statistics or research is telling that. But really interested to see if other panelists agree with that, because sometimes it's a hit and miss depending on who I'm speaking with. We also have to be really real, and I say this as an Irish MEP that houses in our country, in our member state, a number of the big techs. You know, I'm really terrified of what's happening in the United States is very much going to happen here. And I say this as an LGBTI individual and ally, where you can have loose language being used against persons, our transgender community in particular, and align that to being with the mental health condition, and that's language that's celebrated and championed and not removed on the digital platforms in the United States, but yet we house them and we utilize them as users here across the EU. So the digital media and DSA and DMA are something that we desperately need to tackle, so that there is no grey areas, and that I could even go down as far as the realm of the likes of deep fakes. And we talk about the bullies in the pockets. I mean, deep fakes right now is synthetically created images, videos, and audio files. What we know from current research is 96% of those deep fakes are pornographic. 99% of that victim is a woman and young girls. And to be really gender specific, I mean, you've bullying, but then you have images now that are out there, and that compounds to someone's mental health naturally. But you know, you turn to someone who, perhaps a friend, be it online or offline, that might not have that skill set to support you, then that only intensifies. So back to the point I made earlier around that skill set, a digital skill set. If this is the world we are living in, which it is, it's not going to go away. Our relationship with the digital is only going to grow and intensify. Then we need a specific skill set within the mental health space to deal with, be it online or offline, of the complications that brings, the good and the bad and the indifferent. And we need to understand that. And I mean, there are a couple of the highlights that I think from a policy standpoint, we certainly have teeth in the game to change. But the end goal is, how do we remove the stigma or any sort of attachment or negative connotation that we have with mental health awareness, mental fitness, whatever we want to phrase or call it. And back to the point as was made, you know, the physical well-being of a person is, we create policies to mind them. Mental health should absolutely be in the fold of that. I don't come to work in just the physical sense. I come in all beings, so therefore all beings should be protected and minded, and that's what I often push back to the Commission. And we have allies within that, and I think that's really important to stress. We just need to now make it across every table, across all committees, and across all member states.
Well, thank you. There was a recent TV series in French on French Prime. Shouldn't be advertising them, but it's called Nudes, which really tackles this question of sexploitation amongst young people, and it's really well worth a watch to get the very complex and difficult scenarios that throws up. Claudia, coming to you, there's a lot to unpack from what you've heard the other panelists say, but feel free to do so, and then tell us what direction we need to go into with solving these problems, you know, from a policy sort of level.
Okay, so I'll take the example, we're talking about digitalization, but I think this can apply to everything. So there are three things. One is with the specific example of digitalization. I know John Haidt and the Anxious Generation actually have it there. I have to read it. I started, but you know, you need to find the time. And I think the concept is good. The concept also because it talks about how we've abandoned people online, so we're becoming super protective offline, but not online. Policies about removing phones from school, fine, but not alone, because you need to create literacy, because the tools, I mean, the digitalization is here to stay, so people will use phones. So you do need to increase literacy, not only of children, but also parents, because often parents have no clue how to deal with this. They don't even understand the whole thing. It's changing so rapidly that's just the reality. So doing that, but not just that. You also need to keep accountable those that are creating machines that are highly addictive. You mentioned the addiction, the algorithms, the fact that you cannot put your phone down, the fact that you keep being fed more and more of the same information. So absolutely that. We have the DSA, but we also need to make sure that that's correctly implemented. And this links also to the material that you find online. So we really, really, really need to be mindful of the language that is out there. And this is a big responsibility also for media, for instance. The language that you use. You should not stigmatize. You should not be exclusive. You should not use any hate speech, for instance. So this is really, really important, or of the content and what is done. And then we were talking, I heard here and there about the fact that, yes, that we need to hear from young people and how we can do it. It's more than that. It's not a consultation anymore. We need to use what we at Mental Health Europe call a co-creation approach to mental health. And that means that not only you give the space to the people that are the target of policies or practices, but also that the other people and experts that are sitting at the table are ready and able to learn from that expertise and take that expertise on board. And that takes work, but that is feasible, and that is what then can bring us to policies and practices that are actually effective, because we just cannot, we were talking also about the funds, we cannot afford anymore to have things that are not effective. And then the last thing that I wanted to say, you were talking, and I really liked what you were saying. You were saying that mental health problems are not personal issues, they are systemic. And that we don't need short-term fixes. We don't need to put patches. We need to have some coherent approach. And that is why we as Mental Health Europe, but not just us, also the Council, the Parliament, etc., we are and keep asking for an action plan, a European action plan or strategy on mental health. We have a comprehensive approach on mental health. That is it gives a nice overview of the things that can be done, but we need more coordination. We need to provide more support. We need to have some targets, benchmarks. We need to have a dedicated budget. We need to have a better coordinated approach. And that can be done, competency or not competency, that can be done. And I think that there is a hunger for it. So, there you go.
Building on this idea of the co-creation approach, what sort of initiatives work? And I'm thinking to how does it fit in the public-private philanthropy partnerships, the PPPP partnerships? I mean, how useful are they, and where do they fit into the overall ecosystem?
It can be very useful, but I think I was just listening to what Claudia was saying, and I think for me there's an interesting point here about how holistic your solutions are. So if I take one arrangement we have, which is Tackle Your Feelings, which is a brilliant programme which was initiated by Rugby Players Ireland about 7-8 years ago, and it's made a huge difference. But it can't just be about encouraging young people through role models in sport to be prepared to talk about their mental health issues. We've mapped that programme, and we've run another programme in Australia called Tackle Your Feelings, working with coaches. Now, the average age of a coach and the average background of a coach means that understanding the mental health issues that we're talking about, but understanding the digital consequences and solutions, if you like, that are available is a real challenge for those people. Not everyone, but for a number of those people. So we have to have a solution that embraces the family, embraces the community, embraces the coaches, as well as embracing the young people who are struggling with it. So for me, that's the perfect answer, is if you attack this at all angles, including education. And that's why we've developed tools for that. And they seem to work, but they need to be copied and replicated across different parts of our communities.
Sarah, at a global level, what are the opportunities politically, if you like, to put mental health for youth on the political agenda?
Well, I think there are a lot of opportunities. As I mentioned, the G20 will have youth mental health as one of their priorities, thanks to the leadership of the South African government. And I think that's helpful because it brings in the economic angle as well, and the missed opportunity if you don't invest in prevention as well as treatment and support. So that's one very important discussion this year. As I mentioned, we have the UN high-level meeting in September. This is the first time that there's been a UN high-level meeting that talks about mental health, which is extraordinary, but there you go. So it's about mental health and also non-communicable disease. That's an important moment. There will be a document that's negotiated amongst member states, of which the European members are so important, and the European institutions to positively influence that document. Some of the things that we'd like to see, which we've touched on a bit here, but a key part is, of course, child and youth mental health and investment in what works for child and youth. But there's also behind some of these things still problems around not just stigma, but actually legislation and whether or not people have the right to a dignified approach to their mental health. Are they locked up for unnecessary periods of time? Are they treated with dignity while they're in an institution, or are they chemically or physically restrained? Those are the hard issues that need to be tackled, including through this process. So I think those are two opportunities. And then at the World Health Assembly, there will be discussions about mental health, and in fact it includes things around connectedness and the work that the US Surgeon General, the previous US Surgeon General, has done around exactly that, around digital health. And he had some very good recommendations in the report that he put out. And then my friends from UNICEF would want me to say that they've also worked on thinking about the solutions or the next steps, and there's more work coming from UNICEF and others on digital mental health. So I think there are opportunities to build them into a few of these moments.
Kasia, you wanted to add something?
I was triggered by the words partnership and co-creation. We are working on partnership on brain and mental health. And as you noted, very often the communities are very much apart. So this is the first time we'll be investing quite a lot of money together with the member states to bring the communities together and to have common research, clinical research projects and research to understand basic research and clinical research. And what is important is that really there has been such a mobilization of funding resources going into that project. So we will have around 600 million euro for a period of 7 years. All the EU member states are part of it because it's a Horizon Europe funded partnership. There will be countries outside of Europe also contributing. So, okay, it won't be results tomorrow or next year. It will be in 7 years' time with research projects. But I'm hoping for a really fundamental and needle-moving evidence base to come out of it. And the partnership is very much co-creation at the heart. Wide consultation, including with youth organizations, but also where I hope it will go is that it will create an ecosystem for research, for those who want to be researchers in mental health and brain health. We are talking about the lack of capacity, unmet needs. I think it's also about training the future generations, and that it will create a space for those who are innovators, who maybe with a prior history of mental health issues want to propose a solution, and they will be able to look for funding and be connected with people who have access to funding or want to bet their money on startups in that space.
Well, I'm seeing quite a lot of questions coming in from possibly online or in the room, but through our app. So I have one question from Saif Tahir from Egypt, who says, is proudly a Z Zurich Foundation scholar. The question is, do your support programs and services extend beyond the EU, particularly to the Middle East, North Africa region? Gary, do you have programs operating beyond the EU?
We do. And Saif actually is one of our supporters, and he's a brilliant individual who's created an organisation that particularly focuses on young men in Egypt and the stigma that goes alongside having any form of mental health challenge or struggle. So we do have that, and we also, I mean, Turkey is a great example for us. We have a major program in Turkey where we work together with the government, with teachers, and with local communities, and it's another really good example of joint funding because they effectively match our funding, not all in financial terms, but in resource terms. And commitment is really key. Being visibly committed makes a big difference to the teachers involved and the communities involved as to why that's successful.
Katie Buckingham from Altruist in the UK asks an interesting question which we can build on as well, because she's asking, what role do youth services, for example youth clubs, play in building resilience and preventing mental ill health in young people? But what is interesting as well, she's asking, how can we advocate for long-term investment from local authorities in preventative approaches? Claudia, perhaps I could ask you to, I mean, not necessarily local services, but how do we spread the need for investment amongst different players, different stakeholders? Because some of the programs we're talking about, they're talking about the need for trained staff. That requires funding. Where's that funding coming from? Let's talk about filthy money for a minute.
Well, I think that there are various places in which we can look. First, of course, partnerships and working together at political level, and we have now the great opportunity of having an intergroup in the European Parliament. I think that part of it, if you look, start with changing the curricula at school. So mental health is not just for people that want to work in the mental health sector. Mental health should be there in different roles and for different roles. Then, of course, let's think about supporting and promotion programs that can be supported by employers and insurances. So there are various ways in which we can work. And also what I think we need to think is that some types of fundings are faster and more flexible than others. So while we are getting things more set in stone, or we try to change the system, which does take time, to try to mix and bring in also funding that can be more flexible, and that's where I'm thinking, for instance, about the employers and insurers. So there are ways there in which we can do that, and then of course doing a lot of knowledge brokering about how important promotion and preventions are, but not just they're important, they are effective. So you were mentioning before, and we was also having a chat, they function, they work. So why are we not investing more? So let's bring that. Look, there is a lot of talk, for instance, around preparedness, emergencies. We talk about competitiveness, emergencies, preparedness. This is about preparedness. This is about competitiveness. I don't like using that argument, but at the end of the day, it is. So we have arguments.
Yeah, you see me nodding.
Yeah.
No, for sure. I agree. I mean, one thing as you asked the question, and great question from the United Kingdom, who actually are doing stellar work in some regions around mental health. And as an Irish MEP, you miss them being in the Parliament making these arguments, particularly around mental health and the pilots and the schemes that they run. I mean, one word that comes is consistency. Consistency in financing, similar to, I would say, around gender budgeting. Anytime any sort of envelope leaves, be it European, national or local wallets, it's taxpayers' money at the end of the day. It's not some hidden check here. It's taxpayers who are contributing, and for me, it's a public health crisis that we face. I think you had alluded to that earlier. So across every facet, the mental health of the citizen that you are working with in whatever program, be it large or small, has to be brought into question. And I say that as someone who's continuously arguing around the MFF now, or the different funding streams that will come from that.
Lana, the economic burden of mental health is real for young people themselves as well. I mean, how do we mitigate that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And first of all, I would like to just comment shortly on the importance of education about the mental health. And actually tackling this issue. Of course, I'm here and I'm also representing higher education students, but it's very important to tackle this issue from primary levels, from early education, and it's important to invest in that, to build resilience and to build coping skills, because that's also the time when young people are getting exposed to stress, also to failure, learn how to cope with that. So it's also important to ensure free, accessible support services in schools, at universities. When you give opportunity to young people, to children, to access these services, it's also a way of promoting destigmatization of it. When you show them that this is something that's available for you in school, we can have this conversation here, it's safe to do it, it's something that they will take further with them. It's something that they will take along. And I would say, economically speaking, ignoring this issue and not working systemically on solving it, it creates even bigger economic burden than working on strategies how to actually work on prevention. And talking about the general economic burdens for young people nowadays, we unfortunately don't have the luxury to have the security to know that we need to study, we need to work hard to get a job, and we will be able to afford housing, we will be able to safely take care of our families and enjoy a life. Because for now, for generations of young people today, that's not enough. Working hard and being persistent in the job, it's unfortunately not enough for them to have economic security, which of course when you are living, which is something that I'm sure every student has faced, when you live in a situation from when you need to pay close attention to every euro, every cent you have, it's not comfortable feeling. And it doesn't allow you to focus on other things, which is also trigger for more and more burden and more mental health issues. So I think this is also one of the things that really needs to be addressed, and we need to start realizing this more and more in broader circles, that unfortunately young people don't have security, and they're eager to find security about availability of clean water, about ecological issues that we're facing, about finding the job and being able to provide from themselves. So from that note, I think that we really need to invest and look in strategies that are overarching. And once again, we really need to focus on young people, because they're the priority and they're the ones on whose burden will be to continue the work that is being done today. So it's also an investment for all of our futures. And I would also like to comment on co-creation part. And I'm sure we will also probably tackle that at the end. But just asking young people for feedback when the document is already over, that's not democratic participation, that's not co-creation. We really need to change that. And we really need to involve them from the beginning to address all of the issues and the root causes.
Claudia, I think you had wanted to come in response to Maria.
There were two. It was actually in response to the Commission, but also here, like, you're absolutely right. That's why I was like, it's not a consultation. It's not that tick of the box exercise. Co-creation is from the very beginning to the development to the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So, and we have, as Mental Health Europe, we have developed guidelines and a toolkit on co-creation, which is available on our website. So whoever is interested, you can have a look there. I was just thinking, because you had asked, and I forgot to mention that, about how to get the funding for this. I think research is very important, and so I'm really, really hoping that research funded also by the European Commission will go beyond the normal understanding or the traditional understanding of innovation, which is medtech, into looking at what are recovery-oriented services. And recovery-oriented services include certainly support, medical support if it is needed, but it's really way beyond that. It's about peer support, it's about primary care, it's about having people that are experiencing issues being made, having the space to be in the driving seat about their recovery. So broadening this view of mental health and having this broadened view. Thanks.
Mikey de Groot from Zurich Insurance Benelux has a question. She's asking what global best practices can be adopted by the EU to enhance youth mental well-being. I suppose any ideas for best practices or suggestions from around the world that stand out to you, or any of the panel, I think, as well.
I mean, it's very context specific, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, everyone has good and bad mental health, and you will have periods where you feel, often will. But for those who need longer term support, you will need a system of what they would call referrals. So I think the starting point is you're seeing more and more models in different countries. I was talking to colleagues from Kenya, from Uganda, for example, last week, about models where you have quite successful peer-to-peer learning, or where you have a recently graduated student who has some basic training who is able to convene groups for interpersonal kind of discussions and peer support. So you can start with that, but it only works if there's a referral system. So if there is something that is more serious, they have someone to go to. So I think in each context, it is good to think about the peer-to-peer support. It's good to think about the informal ways of supporting in the community, but every country needs to invest then in the referral pathway to enable people to get support. And I think there's sometimes a bit of an overemphasis on the informal, but that puts a lot of pressure on those peers who are being the counsellors. So I think that's an important thing. In terms of other areas, there is discussion of apps always, and digital interventions. There are a lot of apps that are developed that don't really go anywhere, to be honest. Headspace is one of the few that's had more attention. But even there, what you will see is a relatively short period in which people use it. But I think it's useful to have some apps, and I think the learning from multiple places is, again, that apps can help you with basic mental health and well-being. They are not for severe mental health conditions. And I think for severe mental health conditions, that it's all about the dignity of the treatment, it's the access and the ability to live in the communities. And you've seen different examples of different places around that. So I'd rather give a list afterwards of specific ones, but I think there's some basic learning behind what we're seeing. I guess the piece to end with is I do think that some of the interventions that Zurich has been funding, for example, in sport, you've seen some quite interesting models where you've seen very clear success rates for using sport as a way of bringing young people together and then giving them the opportunity to discuss and express their feelings, but also to find ways through adversity. There's a very famous program called Waves for Change in South Africa that's well known. Strong Minds is working in other parts of Africa. So there are those kinds of models that are successful.
Gary?
I just add to that. I mean, I've seen in this part of the way that we've looked at things, the analytics have improved dramatically over the last few years. So when we say sport isn't always the right answer. For some people it's a great answer. For some people it actually makes them feel more pressurised, more stressed. And actually, not just Zurich, I think across the board we're seeing much better analytics, which helps support the effectiveness case dramatically, actually.
From my own personal experience, my nephew was born during COVID in Canada. So for the first few years of his life, he never saw an adult's mouth move apart from his parents. But in Canada, they have a kindergarten system where all children are taught sign language, regardless. And the resilience that gave them, and that was not a COVID measure, that was simply something that was done. And it's programs like that, but the analytics afterwards showed that those children there were actually more resistant to some of the downsides of COVID than those without that element in their schooling system. Maria, any other examples you want to highlight that you think are good for bringing to Europe?
Yeah, I mean, just to shout out, tackle your feelings. I have a friend who, we didn't even set up this way, one of my best friends works on that programme with rugby players, and we debate and discuss all the time the impact it's having on some schools that have brought that in. And ultimately, we debate and discuss how do you replicate that across from an Irish perspective, not just the 26 counties, but look at it from an all-island perspective is most important. I mean, Finland do great work, picking up from your own lived experience with your family. Finland do great work in Montessori's or early childhood in terms of teaching feelings are on you. So in Ireland, we have the Bronurm, sadness is on me. Finland do something similar where younger people are able to have that vocabulary. I mean, can you imagine if we lived in a world where, you know, we have that type of language to communicate? That's positive. You know, not to take away from the digital, even though there's every other day I have a love-hate relationship with social media platforms and my addiction to it. I'm always so conscious that I'm that example where I wake up in the morning, the first thing in my hand is my phone, and thousands of people who want to comment on what I'm doing and what I'm not doing, how I look, how I'm not looking, you know, and I am addicted to the stress of that. And not to make this a talk therapy session, even though if anybody likes to, I could continue on. But you know, it is a fabulous platform. But where I really fear is we end end up only working through telework, or we only speak to those that are not going to meet us down the street. So then when we actually are looking for the resilience to turn to a colleague or a friend or a family member, that language is not there. And that's a juxtaposition we desperately need to fix. And policy can get us so far, and money can get us so far, but we have to figure out a way to live in the multiple crises that sadly are in our world now, both online and offline, and that will continue to be. And we need human contact is ultimately the survival mode for many, I believe. And I haven't quite figured out a solve to get back to that pleasantries of having, as I mentioned earlier, the triangle of work, family, and community. I mean, the church, and I won't go down that rabbit hole, but the church played that role for many, many years, whether we wanted to or not, but we don't have that solve, and that desperately is being missed, I think, for many generations, my own included.
I think we probably all have a bit of a love-hate relationship with social media. To quote Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I don't know, LGBTQI plus community being out is wonderful, but then again, you've also created a situation where there's more attacks in social media. You alluded to it earlier, Sarah, people are locked up in the past. We don't habitually do that anymore. We don't habitually lobotomize people anymore. But at the same time, there's a whole plethora of other risks and problems. I'm going to just read a few comments from online before I go to a final round of takeaways from all of you. And I'd like you to maybe think about your crystal ball or your magic wand or whatever you would like to see or envisage for the future. But in the meantime, Charles Folligue is saying, evidence shows that pet ownership positively impacts mental health. How do we support pet ownership? I'm 100% behind that. Thank you for the comment, Charles. Hamza Salemi says, how do we promote mental wellness of youth in such a rapidly changing environment, such as the economic war by Donald Trump, climate changes, forced immigrations, natural disasters? I think highlighting just a lot of the things we've said already on the panel. Miguel Ruiz from the Baha'i International Community points out that most decisions made at a young age will shape the entire future of a person, and there's nothing worse than having to knowing how to make them and without the correct support. Thank you very much for all those comments and thoughts coming in. We won't have time to deal with all of them because we are 10 minutes from the end. So if everyone could give me a couple of minutes of your takeaways, what would you like to see in the future? What is the lever we can press? Something really insightful for our audience to take away. Kasia.
Okay, what would I like to see in the future? I'd like to see the drop in the prevalence of mental health, the drop in the... sorry, I forgot. Yes. I'll start again. I would love to see in the future the drop in the prevalence rate, the drop in suicide rates, because we mentioned suicide, but actually on the figure, it's the second cause of death among teenagers, which I find really astounding. And continued investment towards meeting those needs. And we came from various angles to it, right? For me, much more investment in research, which is there, which I just want to recall, 7 billion over the last 10 years, 600 million over the next 6 years at least, plus other research on the links between the climate and mental health, not as a trigger, but really how the changes in the increased temperatures impact on our mental health and also brain issues. The food that we eat, right? That we in this kind of we maintain high standards of food quality and safety in Europe. I think this is also very important. I was talking about childhood. I have a toddler, actually no, a 5-year-old now, so preschooler, born in COVID times, and I see very much how his behavior is linked to what he eats or he doesn't eat. And I think having in the list of your committees, Maria, that work on mental health, I would add absolutely those that work on food safety and research and innovation there. As you said, mental health is an all-of-government approach. The resilience pathway, I think this is a very good argument for advocacy groups to say we as a society need to be resilient in the world of polycrisis that we live in, and maintain the attention to the funding and the policy discussion on mental health.
Maria.
You've got us all started now, so it's very hard to condense. But in a nutshell, consistency in funding and political priority, not just for health ministers, but also finance ministers and leaders, because I know from an Irish perspective, if I was health minister, I go in and make my pitch. The finance minister and the leader of that country will decide what the political priorities are. And I get it, it's an ever-changing world. But the mental health, similar to gender budgeting, mental health budgeting needs to be seen across the end at just European, national and local level. That we have the skill set and knowledge to understand when we're at risk or we're moving into risk, and that we're able to do that and move people through. And again, from an Irish perspective, in the most immediate short term, what utopia would be for me is that anybody in an acute crisis is not presenting themselves with their family at accident and emergency, which is what happens in Ireland, because it is unsafe for them, it's unsafe for their family, and because there's physically nothing wrong, is often deterred. They go in, they're asked to leave, and the family members are then on watch for a number of days, and that is an exceptional amount of burden to place on anybody, but most importantly, the patient that needs that help the most. That's kind of utopia level for me in a short sentence, and that, ultimately, from a youth perspective, I'm sick and tired of having to quote in rooms and literally wait for the pin to drop to say the second leading cause of death for young people is death by suicide in our EU right now. And then we talk about competitiveness, we talk about Draghi reports, we talk about what's going on the global stage. It's simply not good enough. So that comes back to the priorityness and the need for us to understand that if we do not resolve the severe risk and pandemic we're living in now, it's your generation that will be asked to clean it up, and that's simply not good enough.
Claudia.
Okay, I have three things. I would say 2.5. One is what I would like is to see co-creation really taken on board properly, so that we can move along with it. The second one is really a real mental health system change, focusing on everything that has to do with the promotion and prevention and with recovery. And to do this, I mentioned again this European strategy, so that's my other thing that I would like to see. And then the third one links to the first one, to the one that I just said about mental health systems. That's why I said 2.5, which is about taking this whole of society approach. It was quite interesting what you brought up about food. I have a preschooler as well, so I hear you. But what is linked to that? It's not just the availability of food. You need to have the time to prepare food. You need to have the money to buy, for instance, organic food. And so here I want to bring it back to, I'd like really a strong push on the social rights. So this year, Mental Health Europe is the host of the European Mental Health Week. This year, from the 19th to the 25th of May, we are going to have the 6th edition of the European Mental Health Week, and the focus is going to be on social rights. You mentioned as well, what are we going to look into? Housing is important. Tackling poverty is important. A secure income is important. Access to proper early childhood care is important. Working conditions are important. And all of these things, we need, the whole of society approach means that we need to see the whole picture. And that's how we can then make the right changes, not just by cherry picking here and there things. We need to have the whole picture, and I hope that the whole picture will become clear to everybody soon.
Anna.
Wow, what is left to be said? It's really hard to come after all of you, and I would sign everything that you already said. But what I really want to see is more seats at a table. We really must be co-creators in all of the policies that affect us. So give us the seat, and we will help build solutions that are holistic, that are equitable, and that are rooted in our lived experience. Because supporting young people's mental well-being, mental health, it doesn't just improve lives. It also strengthens our democracies, our economies, and also our collective future.
Thank you. Sarah, it gets harder and harder as we go along.
Yes, it does. Maybe just to say something a bit more specific, I think each of us has a role in improving mental health. I mean, obviously I co-founded a mental health organisation and we have this huge network now, but I think each of us has a role to play in supporting our peers, our families, our community's mental health. So out of this, I hope everybody in the room, but also everyone watching, will think about what my role is, not what the Commission's going to do, what this department, what that committee, but each of us has a role. As an organisation, we think that everyone everywhere should have someone to turn to when they need support. That someone will probably be you at some point in your life. And so I think, if nothing else, take from this the opportunity that each of us have to make a difference.
Thank you. And Gary, finally,
It's
you get the
definitely
final
difficult
word.
to follow, isn't it? I think what I'd like to see is a dramatic increase in the focus on prevention and promotion. But I'd like to see that by us collaborating with governments and the state in a really meaningful way in terms of private sector state collaboration. And I'd like to see it by not deprioritising focus on recovery, but by prioritising the focus on prevention. And the other thing I'd like to see is, as a community and as a society, we focus on the youth of today and giving them a future that they can aspire to and dream of, because we've had that opportunity and we need to give them that opportunity.
Well, thank you all very much. There's a lot to take away there. I'm not going to try and encapsulate it all, but thank you all very much for your contributions. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you especially for the audience here in Brussels and everyone joining us online for your questions and your comments. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to them, but we never do solve all problem in 90 minutes. Nonetheless, I do encourage you to keep sharing your thoughts with us. You can use the hashtag EA Debates on social media, whether you love it or hate it, and you can find out more about Euractiv debates and events at events.euractiv.com, or you can email events@euractiv.com to find out more about upcoming discussions. That's it for us for today. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great afternoon.